Roman Empire, with all its power and developed infrastructure, projected an image of absolute reliability. It was a world where it seemed that every citizen could count on the stability of their position and their future. However, this illusion of stability was shattered when the legions encountered another impregnable fortress. This was not just a banal confrontation between force and stone. The Romans acted differently. Their approach to capturing cities was a complex combination of hidden threats and extraordinary solutions that turned any fortress, even the most impregnable, into a backdrop for the inevitable finale. One mistake by the defenders, one wrong move, and yesterday's heroes found themselves in a situation that modern people can hardly imagine. Upon closer inspection, their fortresses turned out to be nothing more than an illusion of security, and their fates were the result of a chain of fatal accidents. The familiar way of life in a besieged city could turn into disaster at any moment, and everyday conveniences could become fantastic luxuries. Watch until the end to find out why even a simple mug of water could decide the fate of an entire city. When it comes to the sieges of Roman fortresses, towers, battering rams, and legionnaires storming the walls immediately come to mind. This is a classic image captured in Hollywood films and historical novels. You can imagine the sounds of metal clashing, the roar of walls being destroyed, and the cries of combatants. But in reality, everything was much more complicated and sophisticated. However, their methods were much more subtle and, at times, monstrously effective. The Romans understood that a direct assault always meant heavy losses and therefore was not the most advantageous option. They preferred to wear down the enemy, forcing them to surrender. This was where their genius and cruelty lay. The real battle often began long before a single stone was moved. These were invisible battles for endurance, resources, and willpower. The defenders might not even have suspected that their fate was already sealed. While they were preparing for a head-on collision, the Romans were already laying the foundations for their defeat. The besieging troops skillfully used not only force, but also psychology, and surprisingly, even the most mundane things. They knew how to manipulate fear and despair, turning them into weapons. Whether it was rumors, poisoned wells, or the demonstrative burning of crops, everything was fair game. The main thing was to break the will to resist. One such invisible wall was the elementary, absurd control over food. The Romans turned the most basic need into a weapon of mass destruction. It was not simply deprivation of food, but the methodical creation of conditions for complete exhaustion. The defenders could have had full warehouses of weapons, but without food, it didn't matter. The Romans did not simply block food supplies. They systematically burned fields and destroyed crops over vast areas around the besieged fortress. It was a scorched earth tactic aimed at depriving the defenders of any chance of survival. Farmland was turned into a desert, depriving the defenders of any hope of outside reinforcements or self-sufficiency. Entire villages could be wiped off the face of the earth to cut off the besieged from any source of food, but they did it in such a way that the local residents could see and know that there was no food, and there would be no food. It was a kind of psychological pressure, a demonstration of their omnipotence and determination. The smoke from the burning fields was a visible confirmation of the inevitable. Grain that had been standing in the fields just yesterday was turning to ash before the eyes of the doomed. Their goal was not only to deprive the garrison of supplies, but also to undermine the morale of the civilian population, which, according to the plan, was supposed to revolt and open the gates. Hunger riots inside the fortress were far more effective than any breach of the walls. Disappointed and desperate citizens became allies of the besiegers. Uprisings from within often proved fatal for the defenders. This was not just a tactic, but a whole strategy of creating hopelessness. The Romans left no way out, no loopholes, no hope of salvation. Their goal was not victory in battle, but complete surrender. They masterfully exploited human nature, its weaknesses and fears. The despair of hungry civilians weighed on the defenders much more heavily than any battering ram. Soldiers, seeing the suffering of their families, lost their motivation to resist. Every cry of a child, every tear of a woman became an additional burden on the shoulders of the warriors. In the end, they had to choose between death by starvation and surrender. Entire villages could be destroyed to convince a single fortress to surrender without a fight. It was an example of extreme cruelty, but at the same time extreme pragmatism. Burned houses and fields served as a visual lesson to anyone who dared to resist. The Romans showed no mercy if it brought them closer to their goal. It was not just hunger, it was demonstrative, exemplary hunger that broke the will and robbed people of hope. It was a kind of psychological weapon of mass destruction, working not on a physical level, but on a mental one. Hungry people are incapable of fighting. They become easy prey. Could you remain true to your oath when your children are dying of hunger behind the fortress walls? After the first stages of the siege led to destruction, the Romans were in no hurry to clean up after themselves. For them, every piece of rubble had potential value. Every stone could be used. It was part of their systematic approach to warfare, where nothing went to waste. They thought strategically, turning chaos into a resource. Ruins, wall debris, stones. None of this was just rubbish. On the contrary, it became part of their arsenal. This was an example of their ingenuity and pragmatism, allowing them to use the damage already inflicted to further weaken their enemy. The rubbish that others would have cleared away, the Romans turned into deadly weapons. They found a use for everything that remained of the destroyed buildings. Buildings that had been destroyed, especially near the walls, were turned into traps. These rubble and debris piles became ideal places for ambushes or obstacles. Moving around them was difficult, which gave the besiegers an advantage. Defenders trying to counterattack or reconnoiter the situation risked falling into a trap. They could be mined, turned into firing points, or simply block retreat routes, creating narrow, deadly passages. Roman engineers were masters at using the terrain and destruction to their advantage. For example, in narrow passages formed by debris, archers and slingers could effectively fire at the enemy. In such places, defenders were easy targets. But what was the most unexpected thing? Sometimes they deliberately erected false fortifications or embankments to lure defenders into a trap. These were false targets designed to distract attention or provoke rash actions. The defenders wasted resources and energy fighting something that did not actually exist. The Romans were masters at creating these kinds of mirages. These were not just diversionary tactics, but true works of engineering deception. Each element was carefully thought out to confuse and disorient the enemy as much as possible. They could imitate the construction of siege towers to force the enemy to regroup their forces. Such tricks allowed the Romans to save resources and time by avoiding direct confrontation. Sometimes they even used ruins as a source of building material for their siege engines, right in front of the enemy, to undermine their morale and demonstrate their complete superiority. This was an act of humiliation, showing that the Romans not only destroyed, but also used what they destroyed against the defenders themselves. Imagine how the defenders saw the stones of their own homes being turned into projectiles for catapults. This sight undoubtedly undermined their determination and belief in victory. How did they manage to convince their enemies that these ruined buildings posed a new threat, even though this was physically impossible? They created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty and fear, where any detail could prove fatal. By demonstrating their engineering capabilities and exerting psychological pressure, the Romans ensured that even the most harmless pile of stones was perceived as a potential trap. They played on the nerves of their enemies, forcing them to see a threat where there might not have been one, but where it could appear at any moment. But that was only the beginning. The Romans possessed even more insidious and invisible weapons capable of reducing the strongest walls and the most stubborn garrisons to dust. Ordinary water or even air could become a deadly ally for them. How, you ask? When it comes to disease in ancient Rome, people usually think of poor sanitation and natural spread. This is the standard explanation that comes to mind when you think about hygiene in those days. No one thinks about the possibility that disease could have been a planned part of a strategy. Meanwhile, disease was a constant companion of large gatherings of people, especially under siege. But their approach to sieges was so comprehensive that it even included the deliberate use of biological factors. The Romans were pragmatists, and if something worked, they used it. Any means that could lead to victory was considered acceptable, even if it meant spreading deadly diseases among the enemy population. These were not the sophisticated viral agents we know today, but their methods were shocking for their time. No one was engaged in isolating pure cultures of bacteria or viruses, but they did have knowledge of the contagious nature of certain diseases. They worked with what they had, and it was quite effective. The effect of such weapons could be even more terrifying than direct combat, because the enemy was invisible and elusive. For example, they could dump the corpses of animals that had died from disease, or even the bodies of people who had died from epidemics, into urban water bodies or using ballistae. This was a direct route to contaminating water sources and spreading infections. Imagine the horror of the defenders when they saw decomposing bodies carrying death flying into their wells. Water, essential for life, was turning into poison. Primitive? Yes. Effective? Unfortunately, yes. Despite their apparent simplicity, such actions caused terrible epidemics within the besieged cities. Medicine at that time was powerless against such outbreaks. This led to mass deaths and panic, which paralyzed any resistance. Constant dampness and lack of fresh air created ideal conditions for the spread of disease. In the crowded conditions of a besieged city, infections spread like wildfire. People lived in cramped quarters, sharing food and water, which only contributed to the rapid spread of infection. Every sick breath, every sneeze became a threat to hundreds. This is just one of those unpleasant details of everyday life that can easily make modern people shudder. Today, such methods are considered war crimes and are prohibited by international conventions. But back then, in ancient Rome, moral standards were completely different. People lived in a constant struggle for survival, but they seemed to have their own very specific view of things. Even of disease, they saw nothing wrong with it if it helped them achieve their goals. The Romans were pragmatic to the core, and victory justified any means. If disease could break the enemy, why not use it? And even more so when it came to finding strength when everything around you was supposed to be undermining you. The Romans believed in their destiny, in the power of their gods, and in the invincibility of their legions. In addition to visible siege works, the Romans were masters of invisible warfare, especially underground. Their ability to conduct combat operations in complete secrecy, under the cover of the earth itself, set them apart from other ancient civilizations. This was one of the most secretive and dangerous aspects of their siege tactics, requiring not only engineering genius, but also incredible courage. The enemy was often unaware of the threat until the very last moment, when it was too late and the foundations of their impregnable fortresses began to shake. Underground work required enormous effort and countless man-hours, but the result was worth it, often reducing a siege from months to a matter of days. Their engineers, or sewerers, as they were called in some contexts, were experts in digging tunnels and tunnels under the walls of fortresses. These specialists had unique skills and deep knowledge of soil types, which allowed them to predict the behavior of the soil and avoid collapses. They could accurately calculate the depth and direction of the tunnel, even taking into account underground water, to reach their target with minimal deviation. They had special digging tools at their disposal, such as short shovels and pickaxes, as well as materials for reinforcing the tunnels, including wooden beams and struts to ensure the safety of the workers. This was not simply undermining the foundations, as many might think. The Romans created true engineering marvels underground. Their tunnels were veritable labyrinths leading directly beneath central structures, such as keep towers or storerooms, or to key defensive points such as beneath towers where the main defensive forces were stationed. Sometimes they were wide enough for an entire squad of soldiers, armed and ready for battle, to pass through. These hidden passages allowed them to bypass the most impregnable walls, rendering years of effort to build defenses useless. Sometimes they dug tunnels to collapse a tower or part of a wall, creating critical breaches in the enemy's defenses. In the first case, the tunnel was filled with combustible materials such as wood, resin, and oil, and then set on fire. This weakened the tunnel's supports and caused them to collapse, which in turn led to the collapse of the walls or towers above them. In the second case, a special forces unit consisting of the most highly trained and silent legionaries would effectively emerge from underground directly behind enemy lines. Imagine the shock of the defenders when Imperial soldiers suddenly appeared in the middle of their barracks, hospitals, or warehouses, sowing chaos and panic in the most unexpected places. They were so skilled that they could dig tunnels over long distances, navigating by sound and sometimes even by the smell of the earth. In the pitch darkness of the underground, where torchlight was limited, hearing and smell became their main tools. They could hear the slightest vibrations in the ground, distinguish the sounds of footsteps or enemy activity above them, and adjust their actions to remain undetected. Moreover, experienced sappers could determine the composition of the soil or the presence of underground water by smell, which allowed them to work with maximum precision and avoid unexpected obstacles or collapses. How did they manage to dig such large-scale structures without being noticed by the defenders, especially when work was going on around the clock? It was a matter of incredible cunning and strict discipline. The secret lay in strict discipline, with each worker knowing his task and performing it as quietly as possible, and in the use of specific technologies, such as shock-absorbing pads for tools and special methods for removing soil at night or during diversionary maneuvers. Perhaps they masked the noise of the diggers with the sounds of other siege works, such as the construction of siege towers or battering rams, creating a kind of sound camouflage that drowned out the underground activity. You won't believe what happens next. Stay tuned. When we think of Roman siege engines, catapults and battering rams naturally come to mind. These are the most famous and recognizable symbols of siege warfare in ancient Rome, whose powerful blows shook walls and broke defenses. Their images are firmly rooted in popular culture, becoming synonymous with Roman military power and engineering greatness. However, behind these two giants, which were the backbone of any siege, lies a whole arsenal of inventions that demonstrated the incredible engineering skills of the Romans and their deep understanding of mechanics and ballistics. But their arsenal was much more diverse and complex than just a set of powerful weapons. The Romans constantly experimented and improved their machines, adapting them to different terrain conditions, types of fortifications, and tactical objectives. They understood that a universal solution was not always effective and strove for maximum specialization, creating machines designed for specific purposes, from destroying manpower to completely demolishing fortress walls. Their engineers were true geniuses in the fields of mechanics and ballistics, able to apply theoretical knowledge and practice to create destructive instruments of war. For example, there were ballistas that could throw not only stones, but also huge, thick arrows capable of piercing shields, several layers of wood, and even light fortifications. These giant crossbows were incredibly accurate, capable of hitting targets at significant distances with a high degree of probability. Their volleys could thin out enemy ranks, spreading panic and destroying defensive structures such as wooden towers or barricades. One such massive arrow could pierce not only a shield, but also the warrior standing behind it, inflicting enormous damage and demoralizing the enemy. Or a nagris, powerful throwing machines capable of throwing stones weighing up to 60 kilograms. They were so named because of their ability to lie down like a donkey, releasing a huge amount of energy when fired, accompanied by a characteristic sharp jolt. These machines could destroy walls, towers, and other capital structures with methodical and merciless force. The impact of such stones crashing into fortress walls was equivalent to small earthquakes, capable of causing collapses, weakening the structure of the fortifications, and preparing them for the final assault. But perhaps the most impressive was the helipole, a huge siege tower that not only brought the legionaries closer to the walls, but could also accommodate throwing machines on its upper tiers, turning it into a real mobile fortress. It was a real mobile fort that allowed fighting at wall level, giving the attackers superiority in height and cover. It provided cover for attackers from enemy arrows and stones, and allowed them to fire accurately at defenders from a safe distance, suppressing their resistance. It was the culmination of Roman siege engineering, the embodiment of their strategic thinking and technical mastery. These towers were true mobile fortresses, built directly at the site of the siege from prefabricated elements delivered with great effort. They were multi-story structures covered with raw leather and wood to protect against enemy incendiary projectiles. Each tower could hold hundreds of soldiers who climbed internal staircases, as well as special devices for storming walls, such as drawbridges and battering rams. It was an incredibly complex and expensive machine to produce, requiring enormous resources and tremendous effort. Their assembly required incredible engineering precision and coordination of hundreds of workers who labored in sync, like a single organism. All parts had to fit together perfectly to make the structure as strong and stable as possible, capable of withstanding enemy blows in its own weight. Each stage of assembly was supervised by experienced engineers who ensured that the drawings were followed and the work was carried out to a high standard. Without this coordinated effort, flawless organization, and attention to detail, it would have been impossible to build such giants capable of changing the outcome of a siege. The Romans understood perfectly well that a siege was not only a physical assault aimed at destroying walls and breaking through defenses, but also, to an equal extent, psychological warfare. They were unrivaled masters of manipulation, using every opportunity to undermine the enemy's spirit and break their will to resist. Physical pressure on the fortifications was only one side of the coin, while the other, often more subtle, involved influencing the psyche of the besieged. This was no less, and sometimes even more, destructive, as internal discord and panic could lead to surrender faster than any battering ram. Therefore, they actively used diversionary tactics to disorient the enemy and force them to spread their forces, weakening their overall defense. The goal was simple: to sow chaos and panic, forcing the defenders to make hasty and erroneous decisions under the pressure of uncertainty. Distracted attention, misallocation of resources, and wrong decisions could cost the besieged victory, even if their fortress seemed impregnable. This allowed the Romans to conserve their strength and resources, achieving victory with less bloodshed and fewer losses. These could be false attacks on one gate, accompanied by loud cries and the display of assault ladders, while the main forces secretly prepared for a decisive assault on other, less defended sections of the wall. Or it could be the demonstrative erection of siege engines in one place, with great noise and visibility to distract attention from the real work in another, where tunnels or main engines were actually being built. The defenders, observing these threats, were forced to transfer their reserves, thereby weakening other sections of the defense, which then became easy prey. Such tactics led to the exhaustion of the enemy, its moral breakdown, and created ideal opportunities for a sudden breakthrough in the most unexpected place. The Romans were masters of this tactic of deceptive movements, turning the battlefield into a chessboard. But sometimes their tricks were far more sophisticated, going beyond the bounds of conventional military strategy. They did not limit themselves to military maneuvers, but used the entire arsenal of psychological warfare, touching on the deepest fears and insecurities of their enemies. Their ingenuity knew no bounds when it came to deceiving the enemy and creating an atmosphere of hopelessness. It was a real game of wits, where the winner was not only the strongest, but also the most cunning, capable of manipulating the enemy's perception. They could stage nighttime fireworks displays using incendiary mixtures that lit up the sky and created the illusion of a large-scale attack. Or they could light huge bonfires in several places around the fortress to give the impression that enormous reinforcements or a new terrifying siege army had arrived. In the pitch-black darkness of night, such spectacles were particularly frightening and disorienting, depriving the defenders of confidence in their numbers and the true intentions of the Romans. The defenders might decide that this was a signal for a large-scale assault, or that countless hordes had arrived to join the Romans and were ready to storm the walls. This deprived them of sleep, wore down their nerves, and undermined their morale. In some cases, they even imitated the sounds of large-scale construction work far from the walls to give the impression that new reinforcements had arrived or that even more powerful siege engines were being built. The sounds of thousands of footsteps, hammers striking wood, and carts creaking as they dragged heavy logs and stones could all be part of a carefully planned deception, reproduced by specially trained soldiers or with the help of primitive but effective sound imitators. Hearing these ominous sounds, invisible in the night or fog, the defenders assumed the worst, which demoralized them even more. They may have believed that Rome had gathered countless hordes ready to descend on their walls, and that their resistance was futile. How did they manage to maintain such a level of misinformation for so long, especially given the limited means of communication at the time? It seems almost impossible, doesn't it? Well, to understand the full depth of their cunning and ingenuity, keep watching. For beyond the visible and audible tricks, the Romans were skilled at creating something even more intangible but destructive. They played on their internal demons, using fear and despair as weapons. At the same time, when it came to direct confrontation, they were also at their best, with not only formidable machines at their disposal, but also ingenious tactics for their legions that allowed them to move forward no matter what. The famous turtle formation, testudo, is one of the most recognizable elements of Roman military tactics. It was not just a random formation, but a carefully rehearsed and repeatedly tested battle order that demonstrated engineering ingenuity and strict discipline. Each legionary knew his role and place in this living shield, moving as a single organism. The testudo became a symbol of Roman discipline, unity, and apparent invincibility on the battlefield. It was not just a means of protection against arrows, but also a surprisingly effective method of advancing close to enemy walls or through a hail of projectiles. Arrows and stones ricocheted off the tightly closed shields, creating an almost impenetrable armor that did not harm the soldiers inside. Legionnaires could advance calmly under fire, fearing for their lives and continuing to move forward. This tactic allowed them to close the distance without significant losses, confidently approaching their target. The legionnaires formed a tight formation, raising their shields above their heads and at their sides, creating an almost impenetrable armor. The first row held their shields in front of them, the second and subsequent rows raised them above their heads, and the flanks were covered by shields on the sides. The result was a kind of mobile armored cube, which differed little from a modern combat vehicle. This formation allowed them to withstand heavy fire. The upper rows of shields could be so tightly closed that, according to legend, it was even possible to walk on them. This is not just a beautiful story, but evidence of the incredible coordination and skill of the legionaries. Such monolithicity made the turtle practically invulnerable to projectile weapons. Even the heaviest projectiles could not penetrate this living wall of wood and metal. This formation allowed them to approach the walls, carry out sapper work, or install battering rams, minimizing losses from fire. Under the cover of the turtle, sappers could safely approach the walls and begin digging. The battering rams could work in complete safety, without fear of being hit from above. This greatly accelerated the siege and reduced risks. However, its effectiveness depended heavily on the discipline and synchronized movements of each soldier. Any hesitation, the slightest mistake by one legionnaire, could destroy the formation. Everyone had to act as one, obeying the general rhythm. Breaking the order could lead to the enemy breaking through in huge losses. Any deviation, any breach could lead to catastrophic consequences. The enemy would immediately take advantage of any weakness to rain arrows and stones down on them. A single fallen warrior could open a breach that would threaten the entire formation. That is why training and drill played such an important role in the Roman army. Roman siege campaigns would have been unthinkable without their outstanding engineering skills. This was not just a coincidence, but the result of years of training and the accumulation of unique experience. Their ability to build quickly and efficiently was as much a weapon as the sword or ballista. It was engineering that distinguished the Roman army from many others in the ancient world. They did not simply surround a fortress, they built an entire infrastructure around it. This infrastructure ensured the smooth supply, communication, and security of the besieging forces. Each structure had its own function and was part of a large, well-thought-out plan. The Romans approached a siege as a complex project where every detail mattered. This included laying roads for the rapid delivery of supplies and siege engines, erecting fortified camps, which sometimes resembled small cities in their own right, and even building temporary bridges or aqueducts. The roads allowed heavy weapons and fresh troops to be moved quickly. The camps served as supply bases and rest areas for the legionaries, while the bridges and aqueducts provided access to water and communication across water obstacles. All this created a self-sufficient system around the besieged target. Their camps were so well planned and fortified that they could withstand attacks from outside while the main forces were engaged in the siege. Each camp was surrounded by a moat and a rampart with a palisade, and inside were streets, tents, and warehouses. They were miniature copies of Roman cities, capable of withstanding a long defense. Such camps made enemy counterattacks pointless and suicidal. In essence, they turned the surrounding territory into their own controlled zone, depriving the besieged of any hope of outside help. By creating this exclusion zone, the Romans completely isolated the besieged fortress. The enemy was trapped, cut off from all sources of supplies and reinforcements. This was the final touch in their strategy of total blockade. In addition to active assaults, the Romans often resorted to tactics of prolonged blockade and attrition. This was their favorite method, allowing them to minimize their own losses. They understood that brute force was not always necessary. Sometimes the best way to win was simply to wait. Siege tactics became a test of endurance for both the besiegers and the besieged. It was a long game, where patience and logistics played a key role. Without a well-organized supply system, the Romans would not have been able to maintain a blockade for months or even years. The constant delivery of food, water, building materials, and fresh troops was critical. While the defenders suffered from a lack of resources, the Romans enjoyed relative comfort thanks to their well-thought-out logistics. They completely cut off access to the fortress, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. A ring of fortifications was erected around the besieged city, a countervallation and a circumvallation. The countervalves were directed inward to hold back the defenders' sorties, while the circumvalves were directed outward to prevent reinforcements from approaching. This double wall was virtually impenetrable. The goal was simple: wait until the defenders ran out of supplies, water, or strength. Hunger, thirst, and disease would sooner or later undermine the fighting spirit of any garrison. The defenders, physically and morally exhausted, could not continue their resistance. The siege turned into a test of endurance, which Rome usually won. Such tactics required enormous resources and stamina from the besiegers themselves. The legions had to remain in one place, often far from home, maintaining discipline and combat readiness. The weather, disease, and monotony of daily life could undermine the spirit of even the most steadfast warriors. But the Roman army was known for its ability to adapt and survive in any conditions. Legionaries spent months and sometimes years in the field, maintaining blockades. There are known cases when sieges lasted several years, such as the siege of Masada or Aricia. Soldiers set up full-fledged camps, organized their daily lives, trained, and even plowed the land to provide themselves with food. For them, this became a new, temporary life on the front lines. But they were prepared to wait, knowing that sooner or later, hunger and despair would take their toll. The Romans understood that time was their ally in this war. With each passing day of the siege, the defenders' situation worsened and their chances of rescue dwindled. It was a cold and ruthless strategy based on human weaknesses. It was a victory not of brute force, but of iron will and unprecedented organization. Patience and methodicalness, combined with outstanding engineering and logistical capabilities, led Rome to triumph. They showed that war is not only a battle on the battlefield, but also a battle of minds, will, and logistics. It was these qualities that made the Roman army invincible for centuries. The Romans understood that breaking the enemy's spirit was just as important as breaking their walls. They saw this not as a mere addition to military tactics, but as an integral part of it, capable of ensuring victory with fewer losses. After all, even the strongest fortifications cannot withstand if their defenders lose the will to resist. Psychological pressure could be far more destructive than a direct assault. They actively used methods of psychological warfare. This was a whole arsenal of tricks and techniques aimed at undermining the enemy's morale. The Romans were masters at creating an atmosphere of fear and hopelessness. They knew how to use human emotions to their advantage, turning them into weapons. These could be loud, frightening cries and battle cries before an attack to sow panic. The noise of thousands of voices merging into a single roar could make even the most steadfast defenders tremble. They could imagine countless hordes ready to descend upon them. Such acoustic terror was intended to deprive the enemy of sleep and wear down their nerves. Or the display of captured prisoners and their humiliation in full view of the besieged. This was not simply an act of cruelty, but a carefully planned performance. The sight of suffering compatriots was intended to instill in the defenders the idea that their own fate was inevitable. Such spectacles undermined morale and made people consider surrender. Sometimes they even spread rumors of betrayal within the fortress or of the approach of huge, non-existent reinforcements. Special agents or defectors could be used to spread disinformation. These rumors spread like a virus among the defenders, sowing doubt and suspicion. The goal was to disrupt internal cohesion and unity, The goal was to undermine trust, sow discord, and make the defenders doubt their own strength and unity. If people began to suspect each other, the entire defense system collapsed from within. Constant fear and mistrust made the defense ineffective. It turned the fortress into a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest push. Thus, even if a crime was committed, it was relatively easy for the culprit to hide in the crowd of a large city, and the blame often fell on random or defenseless people. In the chaos and suspicion fomented by the Romans, it was easy to find a scapegoat. Injustice and fear became part of everyday life for those under siege. This further exacerbated internal conflicts and weakened the will to resist. However, injustice and vulnerability were only part of the equation, especially when it came to those who dared to take to the streets after sunset. The night held particular dangers, not only from hidden Roman agents, but also from other hazards inherent in besieged cities. The history of Roman siege campaigns is not just about towers and battering rams, but much deeper. It is a story of how brilliant engineering minds, iron discipline, and, at times, ruthless pragmatism created an army capable of adapting to any conditions. Their methods, sometimes cruel, sometimes surprisingly sophisticated, allowed them to take the most impregnable fortresses, using not only force, but also knowledge of human psychology, logistics, and even biology. In the end, their victories were the result not only of their superior numbers, but above all of their attention to detail, their ability to see not only the walls, but also the possibilities of circumventing them, undermining them from within, or bringing them down without a single blow. What do you think about this part of history? Which people or times would you like to learn about in the next issue? If you enjoyed this, subscribe so you don't miss the next dive into the life of ancient Rome.